these women are full of self-hatred and, you know, as a despised social group, and, you know, fighting against the sort of social constrictions, like you thought you'd have to throw in your wedding day. Okay, so moving on. What about middle class women? I've talked very much about working class women. What about middle class women? Are they not involved? Obviously some do transition, but they're much smaller numbers. But generally what happens is that middle class women are the ones who are identifying as genderqueer or non-binary. Much, much more. What this really means, I mean, genderqueer or non-binary, you know, you're not really a man or a woman, or, you know, you feel female or male at different days, different times of the day. What this means in practice is that they cut their hair. It's a stereotype, but it's fairly common. Asymmetrical haircut, pink, blue, green dyed hair, change the names, shorten the names, wear certain fashions. It's quite clearly a bit of a fashion statement, which is fine. You know, it's the kind of thing that middle-aged women like us should, you know, maybe have a quiet snigger about, as I'm sure middle-aged women and men did about us when we were young. So what? It's one of these kind of passing phases. But it kind of doesn't really matter. You know, if you're talking about young people, it's very much linked into that search for self-identity. And I suspect for most of those middle-class young women, they'll grow out of it, you know. They'll grow out of it, get on with their lives, and maybe just sort of, you know, be slightly embarrassed when they're reminded that they've posted all over the internet that they identify as a white pansexual genderqueer femme, you know. But it's not really a big deal. And that's why I'm talking about how it's the most socially despised groups that are the ones that have the real harm caused by transgenderism. One of the other things I just wanted to touch on very briefly is in terms of autism. There hasn't been any real proper research done on this, but certainly lots of people have noted that a fairly large proportion of people who are identifying as transgender, particularly young people, if you're talking about young transitioners, there seems to be a disproportionate amount of people who are autistic. There isn't the research to say why that is. We can surmise that perhaps that's because they see things more in black and white, and so if you typically like boy things, it may be easier to think as a girl, oh, it must be a boy. But that's a kind of bit of a guess. You know, we don't actually know that, but we do know that autistic people seem to be much more likely to transition who are young. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is that the number of women transitioning every year is going up dramatically. In the 70s, it was really rare. You know, generally, if you thought about trans people, you thought about men, boys transitioning to girls, women. That's not the case anymore. In 2012, you had 1 woman to every 3 men. The latest figures I could find were in July to September 2014, 47% of the gender certificates handed out were for women who were saying they were men. So, you know, we're almost equal there. So it really is an issue that affects women. I also wanted to kind of touch how, I've talked a lot about how it's working class women, but it's mainly lesbians. But one of the blogs you might be aware of is the Dirt from Dirt. She's not a fan of feminists, but what she has done over the years is track and record about young women who are transitioning. She's tracked how the ages have become younger and younger over the years. But one of the things she's also picking up is that until recently it was nearly all lesbians, and she said that she's seeing a rise in young heterosexual women transitioning. So it seems to be moving over into the heterosexual community. I'm nearly finished, I know I've been going on. The other group that gets totally forgotten in all of this discussion is lesbian partners of women who transition. They are just like a totally forgotten group. there is an increasing number of them who are kind of blogging online or putting their comments down online, and there's a whole range of issues that they come across. So first, the first obvious thing is that they're no longer seen as lesbian, you know? They might see themselves as lesbian, but because the woman that they were maybe with is now transitioned to become a man, they are no longer a lesbian. Where does that leave them? They're also no longer welcome at lesbian events, unlike often their partner, because most lesbian events are now lesbian, gay and trans, so their partner can go along, but they can't. They're suddenly not part of the community that for many of them maybe had been a really important source of support and important source of social contact. They're also expected to support unquestionably the transition of their partner, totally unquestionably, and to spend commit both money and time to support that transition. I read a quote that I don't have here, but one woman was talking about how in an interview she was asked how much time do you kind of spend supporting your partner, and she said, I spend about 70% of my time supporting my partner socially with the transition and with their mental health, and that's less than it used to be. There's also in quite a few of the relationships, there can be pressure on that woman to appear more feminine, to back up the masculinity of the partner. And there can also be pressure on that woman to behave more traditionally feminine in terms of doing more housework or more childcare, or, you know, perform the traditional female roles far more, to delineate the difference between them and their now male partner. But they are totally forgotten. I actually read a quote about a woman partner who went along to trans events being supportive of the partner, and they said they felt like a total outsider. They said we were treated like the women's auxiliary, that our job there was really to kind of run around and make teas and coffees and look after all the trans people there. There was no space for their needs or even to be treated as equal humans. So that group is also very harmed by transgenderism, and it's a group that is largely invisible and is very rarely talked about, and where there's very, very few sources of support. I just wanted to say as well that the Gender Identity Act encourages oppressed women to see self-harm and mutilation as the answer to their despised social status. And one of the key things is there's no room for regretters in the Act. You know, the Act acts as if, because the Act, as most of the transgender movement assumes, that it's basically a biological thing, you know. If I'm saying I'm a man, that's something that I'm born with. You know, it's not socially constructed or created by society and culture. It's something I'm born with. So if somebody has went through, you know, all of that and becomes declared a man, then that must be what they are. There's no room for regretters. But they exist. So what happens to these people who transition in regret? Under the Act, they legally remain the gender that they have been given under the gender they do. There is no room for it. Various feminists actually put objections into the 2004 Gender Identity Act, saying that there needs to be room for regretters, and that was rejected quite clearly, and they've said they're not interested in it. So, for example, 75-year-old Gary Norton, he transitioned 23 years ago. He wants surgery. He had lots of surgery. He wants surgery to go back in the NHS, but he can't get it. You also have, you know, the other lie is that it's very difficult to transition. Obviously, the Act changes that it will become self-declaration, but the lie is that it's very difficult to transition in terms of surgery and hormones. But there's lots of cases that show that is not always the case. It may be for some people, but it's certainly not always the case. So there's been, these were top psychologists, there's been cases where people have been found guilty of professional misconduct for transitioning people too easily. Russell Reid and Richard Curtis were both found guilty of professional misconduct. Now, there's lots of cases that were taken as examples of their professional misconduct, but the most shocking one I just want to pick out was a woman who had bipolar, who was treated by them. She thought she was Jesus and she wanted to become a man. She was steps away from having a full mastectomy. And it wasn't because they said she couldn't have a full mastectomy that stopped that. You know, so there will be regretters, there will be people who who want to change back. What happens to them? They're left in a limbo. I just also wanted to say that in terms of women who transition to boys and men, unsurprisingly, those who pass do report lots of advantages. It's a form of self-harm, but it's a form of self-harm that works in terms of how people treat you. We need to acknowledge that as well. They report things like no more sexual harassment, more respect from people, more money for their jobs, better promotion, better previous work reviews. There was a really interesting one I read where a woman who now passed as a man said that in her firm with her client, she met this client now passing as a man, and the client actually said to her, "Oh, I'm so glad I've got you and not that woman I used to have. You're so much more skilled than she was." The exact same person. So, it does have an impact in terms of how people treat them. And for some women, basically the surgery privatises and depoliticises gender role distress. It's very much a private solution of self-harm to a social and cultural problem. Now, that's not condemning those women for taking that route, but it clearly does that. So I guess, to sum up, transgenderism is quite clearly a form of self-harm for women and self-mutilation, and the Gender Identity Act basically supports that and to a certain extent legitimises it.
Brilliant.
We're going to sit here and then Stuart can speak and then you'll speak. Let me just get the camera around.
Come and sit in the middle here.
Okay. My name's Stuart Waiton. I'm a sociology lecturer from Abertay University. I'm speaking here in a personal capacity in case I get sacked. I'm certainly not an expert on transgenderism. I'm more of an expert on, I suppose, on the political elite. I'm actually a criminologist, usually, so that's usually my field. I'm here because I wrote an article for the Times where I questioned the promotion of transgenderism, particularly by the state and politicians, and I think there are a lot of problems with it for society, for parents, for children, and I'm interested to hear what people here have to say about it, because it's actually a very important and quite difficult issue. I think it's quite difficult and interesting. There's a lot of different levels, I think, that you can look at this discussion. So you can look at actual transgender people, especially in terms of adults, transgender adults, and I think generally speaking, and I think more widely in society, I think people would support the idea that there shouldn't be any form of discrimination against transgender people. Mm-hmm. You can look at transgender activism, which I think is something different. And you can look at what's happening with children at the minute, which I think is something different again, and that's something I'll try and come back to, because I think that's the most troubling. And you can also look at the political reaction, the political support for what's happening, which again is something that I'm very interested in. I think it's interesting. Just a few points I'd like to make just as I go. First of all, I think there's a confusion about this has got some connection with gay rights. I don't see what the trans arguments about equality as being anything like what the gay rights movement was. As I say, I think that even quite conservative people today, at least, would support transgender people not being discriminated against. I don't think it's not like a situation of criminalisation, which existed in the past, which is something of great significance for society and for the individuals involved. Nor do gay rights activists, or did gay rights activists, demand that society change social categories like male and female to suit them and to suit their feelings, which again seems to me quite significant, quite profound and interesting. Interesting is probably the wrong word. Problematic development that's taken place. So there's I've got other problems in terms of, for example, the LGBT Youth and Scottish Trans Alliance have brought out a guidance for schools on this issue. This was discussed by Janice Turner in the Times, where she was looking at, and I've got it's a copy here, I had a look through it to see if she was exaggerating. But there's things where there's arguments about schools, and this is the recommendations. The 16 councils have adopted, 16 and 32 at the minute have adopted this and said that they support it. Said things like, if a trans person wants to use the changing rooms, then the girls, particularly girls, have to accept they're using the same changing rooms as them or using the same toilets as them, regardless of how the girls or the parents feel about that. Again, straight away to me, that seems wrong. There's also a shift reflected in this and other government documents to recognise gender changes based almost entirely, as has been discussed, on the subjective outlook of the individual, which again seems extremely problematic to me. There's a fantastical aspect to this, I think, where you can change your birth certificate, which you can already, from boy to girl. So if you're born as a boy, you can now say you're born as a girl. Something that to me just seems irrational because it's not true. And it's not based on, it seems to be predicated on a therapeutic concern about someone's feelings. And again, this is one of my interests, is about the development of a therapeutic state and a therapeutic society where politicians are increasingly interested in trying to engage with how we feel. So you even have things like the happiness index and things like this where they're trying to measure how happy we are. Which again has got highly problematic aspects to that. Highly problematic, let alone about the nature of politics, politicians in the state. And this is part of how I think you get this discussion about recognition, right? Because this is the idea that you need to recognise people, right? And there's discussions that people must be recognised, because if you don't recognise them, it's hurtful, it's harmful, and so on. So feeling good and how people feel seems to be what the state and politicians now think is a key part of their role. And so therefore you have to recognise. If an individual says, this is what I am, you must recognise that. For me, this encourages a narcissistic culture, right, where essentially what you say you are, then society and the state must act accordingly. Again, something which I think is highly problematic. The subjective turn, of course, doesn't simply relate to transgender questions, but what appears to be a wider confusion in society about identity more generally. So, for example, in some of my worst moments, or possibly my best moments, I do wonder what my employers would do if I asked to be on a diversity committee and claimed to be a black woman. And I genuinely wonder what they would say.
Yeah.
I really do. I really wonder what they would say and if they could say anything at all. So if I'm going to be disciplined at any time in my work, I might pull that one and see what happens, just for the fun of it. So this self-definition of self, I am what I say I am, suggests that there is an implosion of social and cultural norms. And if you look at the example of schools, we have another problem, which is the issue of consent. So the idea is that my daughter here, she can tell you this is some truth to this. What seems to be the trend now is that a lot of young girls are becoming transgender, right? Not young boys, but a lot of young girls are becoming transgender. And there's a discussion about whether you should allow 12-year-olds even to start a sex change in the future. This is again one of the discussions that's being had. Again, the question of parental rights just seems to disappear in this context, and particularly when schools are now being pushed to promote the idea that you must recognise as soon as a young person, a child, says that they are a boy or a girl, has changed gender. This is being promoted now. And this is, you can see this in the guidance for the schools. An interesting aspect of this transgender-based issue, if really discussed, is the different types of gender dysphoria. Something I didn't know much about, so I started to prepare for this talk and thought I should actually find out what I'm meant to be talking about. In particular, what's been called rapid onset gender dysphoria. So it's ROGD, ROGD. And it's perhaps this one that I think is the most problematic and worth looking at, especially in terms of the state and education system starting to support young people who appear to be going through what's being called rapid onset gender dysphoria. This has in part been developed by two psychologists, Bailey and Blanchard. The experience is very modern, so it's almost within the last 10 years. This seems to have become a significant phenomenon. It's in adolescent girls. So previously, you had gender dysphoria recognised within younger children, boys and girls, and older adults, particularly men. But now at adolescence, you have this thing called rapid onset gender dysphoria, where a relatively significant young number of girls start to claim to be transgender and have thoughts about being transgender. And they describe this as it's like a cult-like fad that is socially, culturally, and some extent politically created, helped by the internet, trans activism, and what I would call a form of confused liberalism, where we think that this is progressive and positive, and so on, relate to diversity politics, which was being mentioned, which I think is also important. They argue, we believe that rapid onset gender dysphoria is a socially contagious phenomena in which a young person, typically a natal female, comes to believe that she has a condition that she does not have. Now, if they're right, this has got huge implications for what's actually happening and is going to happen in education with the support of young girls saying that they have they're transgender. They see this as similar to the false belief of recovered memory of childhood abuse, which they describe as a false epidemic of the 1980s, and see this as a similar sort of epidemic phenomena that's developing in modern society. They and others also go on to discuss the increased mental health problems associated, not with denying your transgender identity, but in supporting it. Because this is often a claim that if you don't support your transgender child, it leads to mental health problems. They argue that actually, if you look at the statistics, if you support your child being transgender, actually mental health problems continue and can increase. So again, for me, initially, straight away, a problem I have with this is that we're talking about this in terms of 12-year-olds potentially, in terms of initiating sex changes. So rather than even talking about this is before we even get to an adult discussion, this to me seems to be a key issue, that people who aren't allowed to buy cigarettes or buy alcohol can change what sex they are seems just profoundly irrational to me. Like many documents and policies that undermine parental rights, the guidance document represents its views about transgender choices as objective, rational and impartial, and they keep using these words throughout the document. Whereas the arguments they use about the dangers of not validating gender changes are contested. So they represent their arguments as if they are just facts, that they are being impartial, and talk about parents as being, you have to correct them because they've misunderstood things. If you challenge it, you just don't have the facts or the correct type of understanding. And of course, many of these things are value-laden, and they're also political. And there's a denial of this, which is the problem I have, that there is a denial of the fact that these are value judgments, political, in a political framework, that are being made, rather than these are not simple objective facts. And even the objective facts that they represent are extremely one-sided as far as I can see. They talk about health and well-being, but they don't mention all the problems and the difficulties that were mentioned in terms of the breast binding, the hormone treatment, and everything else that goes with it. Potential lifelong health problems, hormone treatments and so on that can go with this. You can make your points at the end. And you can argue in favour of these things. You can argue in favour of the points that have been made in these documents. But it seems completely disingenuous to me to argue that this is just science and neutral. Sociologically, I think we could perhaps cheekily adopt the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria to suggest that what we are witnessing at the level of the elites in society is rapid onset political dysphoria. Dysphoria meaning a state of unease or generalised dissatisfaction with life, so perhaps disarray might be a better word than just dysphoria. For me, I think the situation we're in is that we have an elite that lack grounding in beliefs or traditions, and like the question of identity itself, seem constantly changeable and fluid. And I thought I'd give a few examples of these, some of which you might support or not, so for like gay marriage, for example. But I just thought I'd throw them out just to illustrate something I think is quite interesting in politics, which is that you have issues that come from nowhere, virtually, and become moral absolutes in almost no time at all. So whether you think gay marriage is good, bad, or different, it doesn't matter. What's interesting about it, and you can do a search on this to see when it actually emerges, is that it didn't really exist as an issue until relatively recently. Right? I mean, I'd never even heard, never contemplated it, never heard about it. And then suddenly it's an absolute, right? That's unquestioned. And if you do question it, you can be absolutely, you can slap down, and there's an authoritarian dynamic to any questioning of it, which doesn't mean you can't shout at people, whatever, but there does seem to be something more almost sinister than that, and problematic, which raises questions to me about how liberatory some of these things are, rather than regulatory or somehow problematic. So, for example, some of the key promoters of gay marriage were Tories. David Cameron, Boris Johnson, John Major. Right? This is the Conservative Party. I mean, there's a few people here that are at least my age who can remember what the Conservatives were like. And this is the Boris Johnson, David Cameron, John Major, key promoters of gay marriage. What? 16-year-olds getting the vote. Right? Again, you might think this is a wonderful idea. I have my questions. Where did that come from? So it's 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. No one, not mentioned now, any right-thinking person, how can you not support 16-year-old people? It's a kind of, again, becoming something of a curiosity, an absolute. And then with the transgender issue, again, something, nothing to me at all until relatively recently. Suddenly, you get the Antiques Roadshow. You weren't expecting to hear the Antiques Roadshow in this talk, but this is where suddenly it hit me, and this was a couple of years ago. I was watching the Antiques Roadshow, and you had Fiona Bruce, that's the woman, isn't it? Fiona Bruce, and she welcomed James now, Lauren Harries. Now, some of you may or may not remember, this was a little guy, he was like a little kid, a little posh kid, who came on Blue Peter or something, talking about antiques. Oh, antiques, yes, that one's valued at blah blah, right? And so isn't he cute? You know, he had white curly hair. And he's now a transgender woman, man to woman. And he was being interviewed by Fiona Bruce. And it was such virtue signalling. I mean, it was almost, she almost wanted, you could see she almost wanted to rub herself against this transgender person. And she was basically, what she was doing was she was saying to the audience, look, this is the right thing. Look what's right. And look at me. Right? I'm right because and this is the Antiques Roadshow. Now, again, I was talking about the Conservatives before. I think if you know what the Antiques Roadshow is, it's not the most radical programme in the world, right? And this was a few years ago that you had this parading, if you like, of a transgender person, which it felt like to me. There was an unpleasantness to it. And so again, from nothing to now this kind of absolute position where institutions are starting to talk about it and change how we think and how we relate to these things. Now, how long have I got? Do you know?
Keep going.
5 minutes. Right, okay. So again, and then you look at the Gender Recognition Act, right? So this was introduced in 2004, so that's not very long ago, setting out the process of how this should occur, which has been discussed in terms of you get medical people to say you can change your gender and be recognised. But already, so this is only 13 years, and they're now saying we need a different act. Right? So something that was clearly the case of truth and good then is now no longer the case of good and truth. Now it's wrong and bad within 13 years. Right? I mean, laws usually last because they're grounded in something. They have a meaning and a relationship to society and the world. So there's something wrong, right? There's something happening in society which is problematic when you can have something which is seen as clearly true a few years ago and now is seen as clearly untrue. So we get in the document itself, Angela Constance in her ministerial foreword to the consultation document, she says, at the time, the 2004 Act was seen as groundbreaking. Right? So it's obviously the ground's broken too much now and it's fallen through. But it's now out of date. The requirements laid down in 2004 Act are too intrusive and onerous. And the proposals, has been mentioned, we're going to reduce it now from 18 years to 16 years. And what is it with 16-year-olds now? They all become mature. Right? In the space of a few years or a decade, 16-year-olds now are different to 16-year-olds 10 years ago. I mean, if it's anything to do with that's my daughter, I'll slag off my son, he's not here. If it's anything to do with my son, he never leaves his bedroom. Right? So I don't know where they get it's like this idea that 16-year-olds have suddenly become somehow much more mature and can be given all these different choices. Anyway, so peculiar. I could leave this out. I'll just give you this stuff. This is just. So looking at the elite, this is the stuff I'm kind of interested in. So just as transgenderism incorporates a fluid sense of self and a break with fundamental traditions and customs, so too do our politicians and institutions appear to lack a firm foundation or to have strong traditions or principles that allow them to establish strong, lasting policies or laws. Unfortunately, rather than grapple with the wider problems society faces or helping to develop a better public and political culture, they engage with and encourage identity politics, partly in an attempt to look virtuous, but in the process they increase the fragmentary trends in society while promoting an inward-looking narcissistic culture amongst some young people. At a sociological level, I think what we can see is a change from the pre-60s, I'm going to be in very black and white here, but pre-60s period where identity was related to an outer engagement with the world, with big ideas like socialism or nationalism, country and class, and also religion. From the 60s, again, be very one-dimensional here, you had a kind of youth culture development of cool. And to some extent, an aspect of the cool outlook that developed was a bit of a two fingers. Right? And you can say society deserved a two fingers. But when it's just a two fingers with nothing else, it becomes potentially problematic. There's a really good video by Adam Curtis on heckling, where he looks at the changing nature of heckling. It shows how in the past you had sort of public meetings where people would heckle, but they heckled as part of the public meeting. And then 10 years later, that was about 50s, he was looking at the Labour governments, Tories and all this. It was a brilliant, brilliant piece of documentary. It's not his, it was an American guy who made it. But then about the late 60s, you showed these people as like a bit longer hair and they had dark glasses on. And they were just standing up and disrupting a little bit like the transgender activists. So they weren't actually part of the meeting anymore. They were just saying, fuck you, right? It's all about me now, fuck you, essentially. And there was an element of that, an element where you start to get more issues of self-help, relating to the self, thinking about yourself, this kind of aspect of politics and culture started to develop at that time. And today, not only, I think, are young people inclined to retreat into their bedrooms and their online communities, but they, and indeed all of us, are more inclined to retreat into ourselves, into our inner identities, and ultimately into our bodies, which I think is what is happening. It's a retreat from the social and the public into ourselves, and ultimately into our bodies. The trans phenomena among the young is the playing out, I think, which backs up, I think, what you were saying, playing out of adolescent anxieties in the most narrow of arenas, encouraged by a vacuous political class, and our focus or preoccupation with diversity as a kind of moral absolute and political absolute. Young people are encouraged to find meaning in their bodies rather than in the world. And I'll just leave you with a quote. This is from Jordan Peterson, who works at Toronto University. He says, "For every person that you might hypothetically calm by allowing for or encouraging gender confusion, there are 50 people you are going to confuse so badly you won't be able to believe it. We are going to see an epidemic of gender identity transformation errors. And that's the future that potentially holds if people don't challenge the way that things are going at the minute."
Hello. I'm very pleased to be here. I've emerged from my sick bed. You'll hear me coughing and spluttering. But I think I felt a real importance to get here, and I've had a very strange journey, so it's all feeling a little bit surreal at the moment. But anyway, here I am, and I think it's so important that what groups are doing, are organising individuals and discussions to talk about the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act. Because as far as I know, for example in Scotland, no politician at this moment in time has put their head above the parapet to even begin to question any of the central terms of the consultation. So what we have to do is take responsibility for that questioning, and this is part of that, as I understand it. I have to also say, for various reasons, I'm speaking for myself now. I'm not representing any political party. The views are my own. I'd like to come at this discussion from the point of view of the question, what is a woman? And I think that question is relevant both to men transitioning to women and women transitioning to men. So, 100 years ago, we are celebrating at the moment what happened 100 years ago when certain women of a certain class and a certain age, for the very first time, got the vote. Now, the reason why they were denied the vote by many people, men and women, did not want women to get the vote. And we could argue, well, some of those people were really nasty and didn't want to give up power. That's probably true. But a larger reason is that women were not thought of as having the capacity to be rational, unemotional, and objective enough to take part in civil society and make decisions for the furthering of liberal democracy. So it was a collective sense of women's incapacity that prevented women being given the vote. Now, what actually happened with the political activity around that time was the political activity was around reframing what a woman is. In order to be given the vote, what a woman is had to be reframed. And now we can look back and think how prejudiced those people were, how silly those people were. Well, we have the benefit of looking back in hindsight. At the time, it was a very real issue about women's incapacity to vote. And the radical argument was taking place from a small minority of people that actually they did have that capacity. So, since then, over the 100 years since then, we have rethought, reconceptualized what a woman is. We keep doing this. On the whole, we don't reconceptualize what a man is. We assume that a man is a certain person, a rational, objective, and so on. There are changes to that now. But throughout history, this has been the perception of man. In a sense, man doesn't have to account for himself. A woman always has to account for herself, to justify herself and her place. So, 50 years after that, in the 1970s, there was a further wave of feminism where woman was reconceptualized again, because the promised results of women getting the vote hadn't happened, in that women were still, as we know, not taking up positions of authority, paid less, still seen as homemakers and so on. But the crucial point here was that there are women and men are biological beings. We are, on the whole, we bifurcated into two groups, depending on our role in reproduction. This was never questioned. This was seen as a fact. What was being rethought through this business of what is a woman was gender. It wasn't biology. So the argument was that feminists and others, men and women, have argued that gender is a social construct. So when, in the 19th century, we didn't allow women to get medical degrees because or to train to be doctors because they were obviously going to faint at the sight of blood. And when we had all of these restrictions on what a woman could do, it was because we had a particular view of gender. Now, in the 1970s then, we reviewed the idea of gender and the difference between biology and gender with a language which was developing. And what happened in the 1970s was the idea that gender was a social construct. This was a new kind of language which was coming into our lexicon, and it was a very powerful one, because what it said was that we don't know what the differences are between men and women. We know what their biological differences are, but we don't know what the relationship is between gender and biology, because we can't take a baby and put it in a laboratory and find out what it would be like if it was outside of a social context. But what we do know is that gender is a social construct. It's easily demonstrable because what we accept as feminine behaviour in one period of time, we don't accept as feminine behaviour in another period of time. And in that, we also, in the 1970s, we also rethought masculinity, which was fantastic. So before this period of time, when it was seemed impossible that men could nurture, because obviously it was women who were programmed to nurture and to care, and men were not. So a lot of theorising, a lot of feminist politics and so on in the 1970s and 1980s was dedicated to reconceptualising gender, fighting against gender, arguing that gender was a constriction, something imposed upon us from the outside, and something that it would be progressive if we rejected it, if we transformed gender. So the whole idea currently of gender fluidity is not new. It has a new face now. But the idea of gender fluidity was born in the 1970s. And it was born out of a politics. And the politics were that gender is absolutely constraining. We conform to it. Gender is like a language. We have to conform to it to a certain extent. But what we need to do is resist it. Resist it as much as we can. Now,
Yay!
so what has happened since then? What has happened since then? I hope I'm not boring you too much here, but I want to talk just a little bit about how once you start to say that it was unjust that women were treated in that way, it was unjust that gender was constructed in that way, because we are equal to one another. We should be equal to one another. We have to have equal rights. And of course, during the 1970s, there were all kinds of other political movements going on for rights for all kinds of different people, including rights for different ethnic groups and so on. But the point is that, if I can remember what my point is, my point is that in a liberal democracy is emerging. It's something that hasn't existed forever. It began in the 19th century, and hence the fights about whether women could be included into liberal democracy as authoritative figures. The 1970s transformed it again. It talked about, there was a lot of talk about equality, people's rights, and I think that is fantastic. That is progressive. So we were on a progressive curve here. In that progressive curve, it was absolutely the distinction between gender as a social construct and biology as just a physical phenomenon which was real, was asserted. So I'm going to suggest that move towards equality, that move towards diversity and valuing of diversity has actually become something now which is becoming quite perverted. So the genuinely progressive move towards it is shift-shaping at the moment. And I think it's particularly shift-shaping in relation to gender. For the first time, for the very first time, and this is what we have to be aware of, the argument is going that gender is not the social construct. It's biology that's the social construct. Gender, apparently, is an essence. One can be essentially female or essentially male. So I'm going to argue through this that is the most reactionary position that we could possibly take. So if we just do a little bit of tracing of how this emerged. So we have the Gender Recognition Act, which at least the Gender Recognition Act argued that as in liberal democracy we all protect one another's, hopefully, We protect each other's rights to be who we are, whatever our religion is, whatever our belief system is. It's very important that we manage somehow to all live together, honouring everybody's rights to self-define, to have the ideas that they have. The only problem comes, and this has been the problem with liberal democracy since its inception, how do you accommodate that whilst not infringing upon the rights of other people? So this is being played out right now. So, but if we go back to the Gender Recognition Act, 2004, at least it said there had to be some kind of commitment. If you believed yourself to be a woman, and at this point in time we hadn't had the trend towards women transitioning. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. At least there was a commitment, some kind of commitment to engaging with somebody else about whether you were a woman, and it was a doctor, and you had to live in your chosen identity for 2 years. Now, I understand why people find that restrictive. I really, really do understand why people find that restrictive. Because it's like the policing, the state policing of the self. So, but what the language about that was, really, there's confusion of language and sex going on here all the time. But still in 2004, what was expected was that people were going to change sex rather than just shift to another gender. There was some commitment to changing sex. Now, of course, changing one's sex is an absolute impossibility. Absolutely impossible to change sex. But one can see it as a sort of token, progressive acknowledgement that if somebody wants to change sex or wants to approximate the change of sex, it would be a small minority of people, and that their rights to do so would be protected. I don't find that too problematic. It's the consequences that have emerged from that. By the time we get to 2010, we have the Equalities Act, where, excuse me, it's called gender reassignment. So the language has started to shift from a sex change, which we would find very old-fashioned language now, to gender reassignment. And there's a blurring between sex and gender going on. But nevertheless, in that, there are various protected categories. But within that, there are two that are important to us for this discussion tonight. And one is sex, i.e. whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. And the other thing is those people who are in the process of seeking or have already had gender reassignment. Now, we remember that gender reassignment is still referring back to the 2004 Act, where there's some kind of idea that it is sort of about a sex change. I'm saying sort of, not because I'm unclear, but because the law has been unclear. So, since then, there has been a small minority of people who have lobbied for the transformation again of the Gender Recognition Act. It is a small, largely speaking, given if we look at the society as a whole, it is a small proportion of persons who have lobbied for this. But the impact on society has been absolutely astonishing. What the change to the Gender Recognition Act would be, as we know, that we can just decide that we are the other gender. Not just that we are the other gender, but that, which would be fine too. I mean, in a sense, who cares? I don't really care what gender a person, anybody imagines themselves to be. But if that then gets to be, I feel myself to be a woman, for example. I just experience myself to be a woman. I know what I'm deeply a woman. And on the basis of being deeply a woman, I don't know about whether the women here feel that they're all deeply a woman, but I found being female, designated the female gender, quite problematic throughout my life, and it's something I negotiate in my ripe old age. I'm still negotiating that. So if that you feel that you're deeply a woman, you can just decide that that is who you are. And we're now in a situation where it seems reactionary, illiberal, to question that. But not just that. You then can if it's passed, you would be able to change all your documentation. So you're not saying that you have decided that you feel more comfortable in the other gender, but actually that you have become the other sex. You have become the other sex. So your birth certificate would change, your passport would change. All the documentation then, in this blurring of sex and gender, would say that you have arrived at a different sex because you have this deeply felt belief that you're one particular gender. Now, the really crucial issue that we've got to get a hold of here, the really crucial issue, is that if that becomes law, what you then do is you transfer all of these people who've decided that their identity is as a woman into the protected category of sex. And that is the most regressive thing that we could possibly ever do, because we would not be able to say, women would not be able to say, I don't want you in this changing room, or this toilet, or in this hospital ward, or whatever those spaces are, which were specifically designated for women and men, that there was nothing, that sex is a protected category. So we have two protected categories, but one is actually going into the other. And in going into the other, the protection of that category is gone. So, don't quite know where I am here, but I want to talk about the significance of this from the point of view of the liberal elite. I have got into conversations many times with the kinds of people that they're largely men, but there are many women who are part of this narrative too, who say, what's the problem? You know, there are only a few trans people, and presenting women as being weak, presenting women as being, are you so vulnerable, are you so pathetic that you can't share a toilet with a guy? Do you think rapists are going to enter the toilet? Well,
Yep.
well, yes. It's the one thing you are not allowed to say. You're actually not allowed to say that the reason why sex is a protected category is because there is a social structure, and that social structure involves, I don't like it, and you won't either, none of us like it, but it involves the sexual violence from men to women. I wish it were not so. I wish it were not so. I would love to live in a world in which I could safely go wherever I want, without fear of sexual violence. But it exists. It's the dirty underside that the liberal argument liberal people, liberal elite, will never, ever discuss. So this is why we have to take this language back and talk about it. And the more people talk about it, and then the more and more people talk about it, the more men become part of this discussion, then it can't be sidelined in the way that it is, because the transgender lobby have won the rhetoric of being on the right side of history. They've joined themselves to LGBT as if this is a homogenous group when it clearly isn't, as if there's no conflict within that group, and the ordinary person, conflict of interests I mean, conflict of perspectives, and the ordinary person who is not paying much attention to this actually is being told, and I'm not patronising the ordinary person here at all, but there's a collective move towards pretending transgender rights as progressive. So we have to get a hold of that argument and demonstrate that it's actually not. It is taking us back. It's taking us back before the suffragettes were fighting for women to be included as full human beings. Because what it's saying is there is something essential about being a man, and there's something essential about being a woman. For the past 100 years, we've fought against that. We have fought against that. We have said that that notion that there's something essential is political. Is political. So, I'll try to wrap up. I don't know how long I've been speaking now, but I'll try to wrap up with a little anecdote. I got a text from a friend on New Year's Eve, and a very dear friend who just wrote, let's hope for something like, let's hope for common sense in 2018. And I knew exactly what she meant. She knows that I have been under some fire for just merely suggesting that whatever we do about the politics of transgenderism as adults, what we really need to do is reflect very much about the transgendering of children. Now, the trouble with appealing to common sense, I knew exactly what she meant, and I feel, can we please have some common sense here? In one sense, I feel a little bit like the little boy that looked at the emperor and said, but the emperor doesn't have any clothes on, and nobody is daring to say, this is surreal. This is surreal. Men cannot become women, and actually, women can't become men. Mm-hmm. So, the trouble with appealing to common sense is that it's common, and that is that our sense of the world our common sense of the world is made up by different narratives. It doesn't just emerge from nowhere. And the different narratives which the ordinary person just accepts, everywhere you go, from a tiny village up in Northumberland to some, urbane gathering in London. And that is that there is such a thing as a male and female brain. That one can be born in the wrong body. Now, there is no neuroscience, none whatsoever, which will support that claim. But it's emerged into common sense. People argue, I feel like I was a woman all the time. From being a baby, I knew I was really a woman. Well, that is like asking somebody, there's nothing verifiable about that. It's a personal belief system, which we cannot make law on the basis of somebody's belief system. All the law should do, and I'm absolutely for trans rights, by the way. I'm for trans rights. The law is there to try to negotiate the different rights of different groups in our society. The law is also there to set the normative standards about what we would find acceptable and what we don't find acceptable. The minute the law starts to actually shape our world such that the belief system of a small minority group of people must then be the law to which we are all subject, such that even now, although sex is a protected category, in Topshop, in various organisations, people believe that if they just say, I'm sorry, you were barred from this area, trans women, I respect you, but you can't go there because sex is a protected category too. People have abandoned that. So within a hierarchy, we have the following, which is now common sense, certainly to intellectuals and certain political parties, and that is that there's a group that we can call women, and that is bifurcated to cis women and then trans women, and that we're collectively part of this group which is above us, which is woman. So I come back to, what is a woman? What is a woman is being transformed now, so that in the category woman, what cis women, and I think, I don't believe there is such a thing as cis women, what biological women are being asked to do is what they've always have been asked to do, which is to put the beliefs, the feelings of other people before themselves. So in this hierarchy of needs, this hierarchy of being victimized by patriarchy, as it were, what we are told is trans women are actually above biological women, and that what we should do is recognize that they are doubly oppressed. So now we have this strange phenomenon where trans women are supposed to be the most oppressed category in the whole of society, but strangely have the most power in the whole of society, so that women can't say, no, I don't want you in this space. And it's not because I'm prejudiced, it's not because I'm bigoted, and it's not because I'm excluding your sense of identity. It's because the reality is that gender is about the social construction of all the experiences that you've had from your childhood onwards, and many of those experiences are about sexual violence and the need to try to claim a space and a barrier for self-protection and integrity, bodily integrity. But it's also denying the reality. It's denying the reality that there is sexual violence. It would be utterly foolish if women didn't want to protect themselves from that. So women are in a very odd situation at the moment. If they complain, they're told that they're victims, they're snowflakes, they just can't bear to have a little hand on the knee, sort of man up, as it were. But when we do say no, this is completely unacceptable. And at the moment, sex is still a protected category. We should be deploying that. We should be using that. We should be mobilizing that. Then what do we become? We become bigots. We become harridans, whatever word we want to, Nazis. Thank you, Kate, Nazis. So, I would like to reverse this around. I would like to say that this is utterly reactionary, utterly conservative, and we should fight as best we can this idea that this is about being progressive. Yeah, I think I'll stop.
I'm going to turn the live stream off now, maybe have a 5-minute break if people want to go to the toilet, have a cigarette, and then we'll come back to the Q&A, okay?